welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today is the first episode in what will be an ongoing series called Behind the Book. It's where I take the opportunity to catch up with some of my favourite indie authors. And today we've got the amazing Kate Fromans. Hello Kate and welcome.
Hi Chris, it's great to be with you today, and I know it's taken ages for us to catch up, but I'm really looking forward to talking to you.
So tell me, when did you first realise you wanted to be a writer?
I guess I first realised I wanted to be a writer when I saw my dad writing down his short stories on holiday. So we'd be on a family holiday at a rented cottage somewhere. It'd be a really nice summer evening and my dad would always be outside with a really big notebook writing things down. And when I asked him what he was doing, he'd be like, "Oh, I'm just writing a story." So even before I could myself put things into words, I always knew that if I had a story in my mind, I wanted to get it down on paper. It really helped as well that I was surrounded by books. When I was growing up, my dad worked at the British Library and we kind of had our own library at home as well. So I really got a love of books from an early age.
And what was the first thing you wrote?
Well, talking of the first thing that I wrote, actually, and going back to my dad working at the British Library, I remember it was a really big event in the early 90s. He brought home a refurbished computer that they were getting rid of from his work, and it was so old, I think it was from like the late 80s, it didn't even have Microsoft Word on it, it was just a lot of DOS programs, and I actually wrote my very first story based around those kind of computers. So what I did was I had a load of computers sitting in a storeroom, I think it was at the back of a shop, and they were all talking to each other. There was a girl one, I can't remember what she was called, but I know that they were talking about when the new technology was going to come in, and the new computer's name was Know-All, as in he knows everything, Know-All, and it was spelled N0-A11. So I was kind of doing LeetSpeak before it was cool to do LeetSpeak on there, and it was really interesting because I also had to learn how to write on that kind of program, because when I was at school, like primary school, I was obviously using Microsoft Word and like all the 90s versions of stuff, but then when I was coming home I was having to log in through DOS and then write it all down and then ask my dad if he could print it off for me. So yeah, that was the first story I wrote. I can't even remember what it was called now. I've probably got it somewhere. Honestly, I have about 25 floppy disks all of writing from around about that period. So yeah, that was the first one, all about computers.
That's interesting. So would it be fair to say the seeds had been sown for your later work?
Yeah, it was really interesting actually that my very first story was about artificial intelligence, and then I went on to write After the Singularity with Gavin, which is entirely about sentient artificial intelligence. But I also think that at that time and a little bit after then, I started watching a lot of sci-fi on TV. So after that as well, when I was at college, I had things like Deep Space Nine, Farscape and Stargate, and those kind of things really inspired me. But when it actually came to writing, initially, I don't know if you know this, but I really wanted to be a screenwriter. So I love science fiction, I love fantasy, and I was like, this is awesome. I can take it to theatre or TV or film and take my writing down that path. But when I actually started studying that at college, I found that actually I preferred writing down prose and I preferred writing down poetry, and I really wanted to create those landscapes in people's minds. So I guess it actually probably took about 10 years, I would say, between 1993 to 2003 for me to really decide what I wanted to do.
So tell me, who were your earliest literary inspirations?
They're quite far-flung, but I'd say a lot of them are inspired by my mum and dad, because as I mentioned before, we have basically a library at my parents' house, so there was so many things that I could read, basically under any genre, anything I liked. And then on top of that, at secondary school, so high school, I really enjoyed English language and literature, and I think that some of the books that I studied then, like William Golding's Lord of the Flies, really had a massive impact on me. So I would definitely say Shakespeare's Macbeth, Lord of the Flies, and probably Of Mice and Men. They were the most impactful ones from school. Outside of that, prior to going to high school, I would say that my favourite author was Leon Garfield. He wrote a lot of historical fiction for children, but the way that he did it was in a very narrative driven way. So he'd create the world, but through very little description. You just kind of assumed, oh, there's a highwayman, so I must be in that time period. And I thought that was really interesting. So he relied a lot on the characters and the storyline to drive what happened. You didn't really have to pay attention to what was around those characters. Short story wise, I was probably inspired by Robert Westall. He wrote some really good science fiction short stories. I've got a collection called Rachel and the Angel, and there's also a standalone short story called Yaxley's Cat, which is really good. But I would really say overall, like from, I don't know, like 7 or 8 years old all the way through to now, and 30 years later, I would say Terry Pratchett is probably my overarching biggest influence when it comes to writing.
Probably aren't many British authors, especially sci-fi authors, who haven't been influenced by Pratchett. Do you have a favourite story of his?
So when it comes to Terry Pratchett, I haven't actually got a favourite book. Obviously there's all the Discworld novels. I would say the ones that I read myself that weren't read to me at bedtime would be like Johnny and the Bomb, and especially Only You Can Save Mankind, because obviously that's science fiction mixed with fantasy, mixed with the human element of the boy's parents going through a divorce. So yeah, the Johnny books were really good. I would say as well that when I looked at any books with Unseen University and the Wizards, I was really inspired by, like in The Hogfather, when they use Hex, which is their form of a primitive computer, because I thought, well, what is actually a computer? What is AI? And that really got me thinking, and it inspired me to research further. Mort as well was really good. I had the graphic novel of Mort, and the thing that kind of went between fantasy and science fiction was that in there the person had depicted Death's house and Death's domain as being in the middle of a completely black universe, but it was built up on a grid like a computer simulation. So yeah, I haven't really got a particularly favourite book, but I picked elements from all of them, and then I think I drew on them for inspiration, but also kind of incorporated some of them in my own unpublished works. I think if I was to publish any, I'd have to change it quite a bit, just so I wasn't stealing Terry Pratchett's ideas, but they certainly have been really helpful over time to use them as an inspiration and a muse, just to kind of push me that one step further to say, like, what if? But what would happen if this could be a reality? Yeah,
I'm definitely a fan myself of the Johnny Maxwell trilogy. Found them much more approachable in Discworld, if I'm honest. So, outside the literary world, was there one person in particular who gave you encouragement for your writing?
I guess obviously my parents, 110%. My mum and dad have got really different styles of what books they like and what they're interested in. So it was really interesting not to have that one-dimensional, oh, only historical fiction or only, I don't know, craft books. You know, it was so good to have everything around me that meant I could have that thirst for knowledge and be like, okay, I like that, what happens if we combine them? And I did speak a lot about it with my friends at school and at college, but as I said, at college I was kind of doing theatre and the English language people kind of trailed off, and at school a lot of people like writing. I mean, I was in the poetry club as well, but they didn't really want to speak about it, so I kind of felt, apart from my mum and dad, I was really isolated. Although I do have to give an honourable mention to my English teacher that took me through my GCSEs. I don't know if you'll ever get to watch this interview, but Mr. Davis from Cornwallis School, honestly, you saved my life. Because at the time that I was going through my GCSEs, so I was like 15, 16, I was being absolutely relentlessly bullied, like through all elements of school. I hated it, and I really didn't even know if I was going to make it through to my GCSEs. But there are a couple of things that he did. Was we were asked to look at songs. I can't even remember why we were analysing them, but obviously this is like the early 2000s, so there was a lot of EDM dance songs. They didn't have many lyrics, there was a lot of rap going around, and that was mainly focused on like Black American community, so not really something that someone in Kent in England, a white girl, could really latch onto. But a lot of people in my class, I remember, they just took these songs, took the basic lyrics and said, oh, that's about shagging, that's about loving someone broke up with someone else, blah blah blah. But one of the reasons I was getting bullied is that I was a bit out there with my music tastes, and I really liked this 80s artist called Nik Kershaw. Now, Nik Kershaw was cheesy at the time. He wrote really weird lyrics. Some of them are about like Don Quixote. Anyway, loads of stuff like that. So I picked one of his songs, I analysed it, and it was called The Riddle. So I went into like what I thought it meant, how we'd use different meter and tone, and how we created pictures in people's minds, and how we used repetition. And I literally thought I'd just done the same as everyone else. And I remember it was just before lunch, and Mr. Davis asked me to stay behind, and honestly I was so worried. I was like, oh my god, I've completely screwed up this assignment. Why did I even think that I could spend the last 2 hours doing this? And then he actually said to me that I was the only one in the whole class that had dared to go and actually do it properly, rather than taking the easy option and then just doing something quick and chatting with my friends. And he said that he thought I had really good potential. And just him taking those 5 minutes to say to me, no, you did do that right, it kind of made me think, oh, maybe I'm not as bad as I think I am. And then throughout those last few months, because I was having such a terrible time, he used to let me come into his classroom while he marked his work at lunchtime. And I was able to sit there, eat my lunch, do some creative writing or use the computer. And I remember, like, just before I left for my GCSEs, I'd actually written a story where the pigeons, it was basically based in these ruined castles, and the pigeons were one faction, and they were all like the lower class, like the proletariats. I think I'd been reading 1984, but anyway, so the pigeons were like cockneys and up there, and then you had the rabbits that lived on the ground, but they were actually like the ruling class, and they were friends with the crows. And I literally wrote maybe, I don't know, 2,000, 3,000 words, and I just really wanted to show Mr. Davis and be like, oh, this is what I've been doing at lunchtime. He took it and he read it through, and the next day again he called me into his room and he was like, you really need to do something with this. And I was like, oh, what, you mean show the head teacher? And then he said, no, he said, like, I really think that you need to go ahead and become a writer. And although I ended up going down the route of theatre and writing for performance, those incidents really stayed with me, and I think that even now I really cherish that time when I could focus on that and someone actually believed in me that was outside of my family, because it meant that I was getting proper feedback, honest feedback, from someone who basically had nothing to gain from it.
That's interesting. For my own writing, I've always had one eye on it being on the screen. Do you have any ambitions for adaptations of your own writing?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. So, as I mentioned before, I was really initially into wanting to do screenwriting, writing for performance, and I wrote some plays along the way, like short workshop scenes and things like that. But with my books and my storytelling, I've never really thought of them going in to be a film, maybe an episodic TV show of like 6 to 8 episodes, but they'd really need to be fleshed out, because what I feel with my own writing, I like to take a snippet or a window of someone's life and not really give any backstory before or after. I want the reader to start world building themselves. So if it was to go into a movie, I don't think it would really have the same experience. With my writing, the point is, I very rarely give my main protagonist names. If I'm writing in the third person, I will, because obviously I need to describe it that way. But when it comes to my short stories, I let the reader decide, what does that character look like? What's their name? Who are they following? Why did they do that? How did they get to that place? And I'll encourage them maybe in certain directions, I'll manipulate it, but when it comes to getting something adapted for the screen, I don't think that would work, and I think it'd really lose that imaginative element, because you're then not looking at it through yourself as a reader, your own personal filter. You're looking at it through however many people have been involved in the production, and I just honestly think it would take away from my original writing style.
So we're talking about creating a world to explore. How you describe the After the Singularity anthology?
Well, it's the first book that I officially got published. So before then I'd had excerpts of things published in newspapers, magazines. Obviously, like, I write online professionally, and sometimes as a ghostwriter. But After the Singularity, the whole series was actually my first time getting self-published and being able to hold a book. and I did everything for it. So I did the cover, the formatting, it was all me, and it was all a massive learning curve. The book itself, the story is set in dystopian England, and the first story, which is After the Singularity, tells the tale of a retired accountant called Alan Turnpike, and he lives with his daughter and his grandson in like a pretty normal suburban house. But you soon start to realise when you look outside his little family unit that the world has been taken over by sentient machines, artificial intelligence. And the singularity is actually the point that scientists say that machines will be able to teach themselves and they will go beyond our control. So Gavin created this world that I then dived into, where basically England looks normal on the surface, albeit a bit battered, but actually when you look at the bigger picture, it's very, very different, and you have a different government structure. It's basically like a shoot on sight society. If you're not helping the singularity, then that's it, you're done for. But if you are compliant, you keep your head down and you provide a service for them, then you're more likely to survive. So it was a really interesting premise, and the whole series is 3 books long. They were 3 short novellas. So it's After the Singularity, Before the Singularity, and Joshua, and you can find them all in the anthology, or you can buy them as separate novels.
And what was the spark that led you to write that?
So my inspiration for After the Singularity was literally that Gavin had written the first book, or the first few drafts of the first book. He showed me one day, he sent it over via email and said, look, I've just written this creative piece. It was for his university course, and then he just said, like, what do you think of it? And immediately as I started reading, I was like, this is amazing. I can tell what Alan's going to be like, even though he didn't have a surname at that point. I could tell the background stress that was happening in the story. I could tell like just the overall feeling of like, I don't know, ominous, like something was going to happen but you weren't sure what. And then when I got to the end of the original After the Singularity story, I was like, okay, that's great, it's a small period of time, but how did a retired accountant get into that situation? Like, what happened when he was younger? And because it's set in the near future, looking back was really easy, because you were looking back to the 90s and the 2000s, and that's when I wrote the second book, Before the Singularity, completely based in Gavin Harper's world. And then when I'd written Before the Singularity, I was reading through it with a couple of my advanced copy readers and my proofreader, and then I realised this is too open-ended. It's not like you can have the main story and a prequel. There has to be an end to this.
Oh, it is a fantastic premise, no doubt about that. Do you think the story is told now, or would you ever see yourself revisiting that world?
Okay, so I don't want to give away any spoilers, but I do really think that now I've told my side of the story for After the Singularity. I know that Gavin's interested in maybe exploring it in a different way, and I'll be so happy for him if he brings out any books or short stories with regard to the Singularity world in his own right.
Oh, I definitely agree, it has so much potential.
For Alan Turnpike and his family, I think that I've done everything I can to get the story told. It is quite finite. Be that good or bad, you can judge. But yeah, that's done. I don't think I'll be revisiting it. I've got a lot of other things that are happening at the moment, and I do feel that I spent a good 2.5, 3 years solely looking at After the Singularity and researching it, and I really need a breath of fresh air. If I do revisit it in the future, it won't be for a good couple of decades, because I just can't go back into that mindset, because it was really tough.
So, aside from dystopian post-apocalyptic worlds, is there a genre that you haven't touched yet that you would like to explore?
So, although I like writing science fiction and misery, is that a new genre that I've just created? Sci-fi and misery? I'd like to bring it back and maybe look at things that I was inspired for when I was younger from Leon Garfield, and look at writing historical fiction. The reason being is I edited my dad's collection of short stories, which have recently been published as Tales of a Disaffected. And as I was going through that, I suddenly realised that I do have these bits of knowledge that I'd like to delve deeper into. So for example, I'm living in Scotland now, and my dad wrote a story called Duncan's Bluff, And as I was reading it, I was realising I don't really know much about the Jacobites, but it's a really big important part of Scottish history. And again, when I was looking at some of his Kentish stories, I was like, oh yeah, the Pilgrim's Way and Holly Hill and everything that was in Kent. And I was thinking, I spent 2 decades of my life down there, and although I know in passing, I could give you a good quote about what happened, I couldn't really tell you in detail, and I wouldn't be comfortable writing a story about it without further research. And I really think that historical fiction is important because you can draw people's attention back to the past and they can learn from it and maybe think personally, oh, I wouldn't really do that myself, or it might give you a different perspective on things. Because after all, we are all human beings, and things that happened in the past were by people that were very closely related to us. You know, society wasn't that much different in Rome as it is now with our government system.
So when it comes to research, do you like to research prior to the writing, or is it more a fluid thing while you're actually doing the writing itself?
I have mentioned research a few times now throughout the interview. Right, so I don't really think that I would go off when I'm writing a story and specifically, for example, research the Titanic and then go and write a story about the Titanic. I do think it is quite fluid. I usually get the bare bones of something down, write as much as I know and all the different turns of phrase that I want to use, all the different scenarios, and then when I go through the editing process, like my first edit, I will stop after every little bit and be like, okay, is that correct? Is that fleshed out enough? Do I know enough to discuss this? Because obviously I don't want to offend anyone, especially if it's something to do with, I don't know, for example, the Second World War, and you're looking at a Jewish family. I would hate to write something that is really insensitive and comes across in the wrong way. So I'd have to then go off and research about concentration camps and the Holocaust and things like that. So I do actually think that it's more of a knee-jerk reaction to me not knowing something, and I'm really, really self-critical. So say I've written something, actually After the Singularity is a really good example. During After the Singularity, Gavin had written his part, I'd written Before the Singularity, and I hadn't yet written Joshua, but as I was reading it back, I was really happy with the human interactions, but I suddenly realised that although I didn't want to describe the world a lot because I wanted the reader to do that for themselves, there had to be some truth in certain mechanical things, like how does a server work, how does data flow work between 2 computers, could you have a secret neural link, all things like this. So then I had to go and look at articles and also speak to computer engineers, because I had this awful sinking feeling like, oh, I've written this really good book with my friend, but if anyone reads it who's interested in science fiction and is also interested in computers, there are so many holes in my story. In my professional job, I write a lot of articles for people, and I can tell you now, half the time I do not even know what the subject matter is. So they'll send me over a framework and just say we need to cover these keywords in it. It's for wedding photography. Now I know a little bit about photography. I've got a really nice Canon camera, but it's not an SLR. So when it comes to what lenses to use, what's the best lighting, everything like that, I'd have to go off, do some in-depth research, and then write the article from that point of view. I can't just do it ad hoc, because otherwise I'm going to write maybe like 5,000 words that I need to pare down and then suddenly realise it's all waffle because I haven't done the research first. When I'm writing fiction, or I'm writing poetry or prose, it's going to be fluid, ad hoc, knee-jerk reaction. I need to know this to make my story better. But when it comes to writing articles, I always research first, and then I'll follow the client's framework and write it based off my research.
It certainly shows that you've obviously created a very believable, engaging story. So tell me, what's next for Kate?
Well, there's a list behind me on the wall. I don't know if you can see, my head's probably in the way. But I was due to release a novel, which is my first standalone novel. It's not part of a trilogy and it's not collaborated with anyone else. It's called Kingsley Manor. I can't really give too much away. So it's based in true crime. I've done an awful lot of research as I've been writing, which obviously leads on from the last question you just asked me. And it also has a supernatural element to it, and it's set in Norfolk in the UK, and it centres around a girl that's had a relationship breakup. She's in her mid to late 20s, and she runs away to her family's holiday home, and when she gets there, things aren't as she remembers them. So the village is a little bit different, the people that she interacts with have all got different backstories. And basically, as the reader, you'll go on through each chapter and you'll suddenly come to a realisation that X, Y and Z is happening before the protagonist does. And so I want to create a suspenseful novel, almost a thriller. I'd say like a crime mystery thriller whodunit. And it's going to be set in 2017. It was all set to come out for October so that we could have it for Halloween, because although it's not completely supernatural, there is like a horror element to it. I am doing just too many projects at the moment, so I've put that on the back burner. That's going to be coming out in October 2022. I'm currently helping a really amazing debut author from America. Her name's Rachel Levine, and she's writing a young adult fiction book called Culinary Hearts, and that's about a cookery summer camp in the USA in the Catskill Mountains. I was reading it and it's not really my kind of a genre, but I kept thinking, oh, what's going to happen next? What's going to happen next? So as well as working with Rachel, I'm also starting a true crime podcast. Now this is in its really early stages, so there's a lot of research that's happening, and the person that's in control of that is one of my best friends, Liddy, and she actually is French and lives in France. I met her at the same time that I met you actually, Chris, when we were at work together. So that's going to be amazing, but it is a lot of work because I need to set up the branding, graphic design and everything for that. So that's another reason why I didn't want to put through my novel without having full concentration on Kingsley Manor. I'm also maintaining my everyday job, which is a freelance writer and content creator. So I've got a lot going on, and I really want to dedicate maybe 2022, 2023 for getting my novel sorted, and it looks like 2021 is just going to be a hodgepodge of lots of different projects, but I'm really excited, and lockdown is easing, so it means I can get outside and get a lot more inspiration that way too.
Fantastic. So obviously very busy, a lot going on for the future. Well, thank you very much for taking time with me today, Kate. I'm sure that the people who tune in will enjoy hearing what you've got to say about your writing. And to all my viewers, thanks very much for joining us today. I hope you took a lot from that. Now, don't forget, like, subscribe, share the channel with all your friends, and don't forget to come back next time and we'll have another interesting instalment with another author. Take care, enjoy your day. Bye.